You know, there's a question that always seems to pop up whenever this topic is on the table. It's usually whispered, right? It's always debated, and it is just loaded with assumptions. Well, today, we're going to tackle it head on. But not with opinions. Nope. We're going to look at what psychology and the actual research have to say.
And here it is, the big one. Is a man who consensually participates in this kind of dynamic somehow less of a man? Is he weak? Is he deficient? Or maybe broken? It's a really provocative question, for sure. And honestly, the way it's framed, that's incredibly telling.
You see, the question itself kind of assumes the answer is yes. It's like the assumption is baked right into the way we even ask it. So let's be clear, this whole explainer isn't about judging anyone or endorsing anything. It's about pulling apart the cultural programming that makes us ask this specific question in the first place.
Okay, so where does this automatic assumption even come from? Well, it's definitely not random. It's actually the product of a very specific cultural script. A script about masculinity that, honestly, most of us have inherited without even realizing it.
I mean, just think about how familiar these points feel, right? This script is literally everywhere. It's in our movies, our history books, our myths. It's the story that teaches us that a man's worth is somehow tied to possession and control, especially sexual control. And so any deviation from that script, well, it gets automatically labeled as a failure of masculinity. And this is the crucial point. This script isn't some universal law of nature. It's a social construction. I mean, you look at cultures like the Moswo people in China or the Himba in Namibia, they have traditions that completely flip our framework on its head. It just goes to show our script is just one version out of many possible ones. All right, so if our cultural script is just one version of the story, what does the psychological reality tell us? Well, this is where it gets really interesting because the research paints a very, very different picture, one that pretty much challenges everything that traditional script dictates. Okay, so first off, the fantasy itself, it's not rare, not by a long shot. I'm talking about research published in major journals like the Archives of Sexual Behavior, showing it's a remarkably common fantasy pattern among men. So right out of the gate, we have to separate something being common from the idea that it's some kind of personal defect. And this is absolutely key. Research, including some really important work by psychologist Dr. David Ley, it directly counters this whole weakness narrative. There is just no consistent data linking these fantasies to things like insecurity or low self-esteem. In fact, believe it or not, sometimes the data points in the complete opposite direction. Okay, but what about the relationship itself? I mean, if this dynamic really stemmed from weakness, you'd expect the relationships to be a wreck, right? But the data just doesn't show that at all. Study after study consistently finds that consensually non-monogamous couples report levels of satisfaction, commitment, and love that are, well, they're right on par with monogamous couples. No significant difference. Now, to really understand the psychology at play here, you've got to know this one word, compersion. Think of it as the polar opposite of jealousy. It's the experience of feeling genuine happiness and pleasure from seeing your partner happy, even if that happiness is with another person. Now, I know for a lot of us that emotion might sound totally inconceivable, but for people who experience it, it completely changes the game. It shifts the dynamic from just tolerating something to actually sharing in the joy. All right, so this is where we really start to flip the script. We're about to take concepts that we automatically, almost instinctively associate with weakness, like, say, surrender and control, and we're going to reframe them through a completely different psychological lens. And this brings us to a really fascinating paradox. A lot of the men who are drawn to this fantasy are actually highly successful, assertive, type A leaders in their daily lives. For them, the fantasy isn't about being weak, it's about an erotic release from the constant pressure of always having to be in control. So you see, it's not a sign of weakness, it's arguably a sign of psychological flexibility. But the most important distinction of all, the absolute game changer, it's one word. Consent. Think about it. Being cheated on makes you a victim. You've lost all control. But in a consensual dynamic, the man is an active participant. He has full agency. He's choosing this. He's negotiating it. He's building it on trust. The two psychological experiences, they are just worlds apart. So yeah, far from being some passive act, successfully navigating this kind of dynamic requires an incredible amount of active work. You have to be able to discuss desires with real vulnerability, negotiate really complex boundaries with absolute clarity, and communicate constantly. Let's be honest, those are the hallmarks of a strong, intentional relationship, not a weak one. This really forces us to rethink jealousy itself. We're all taught that jealousy equals love, but is that really true? More often than not, what looks like jealousy isn't a display of love. It's a display of fear, of insecurity. A man who is genuinely secure in himself and in his relationship might simply not see another person as a threat. So is that weakness? Or is it a sign of profound self-confidence? And the crucial point is this: maybe we've gotten vulnerability all wrong. Choosing to enter a dynamic that requires this much trust, this much honesty, this much emotional exposure, that isn't a sign of weakness. It's an act of immense courage. It's choosing an authentic connection over just playing it safe. So, where does all this leave us? We started with what seemed like a simple question, right? But it's pretty clear by now that the reality is just way too complex for a simple yes or no answer. Turns out, the problem was with the question itself. It operates from a totally flawed premise. It tries to judge all men against one single, culturally specific script for what masculinity is supposed to be. But as we've already seen, that script, it's a moving target. It has changed dramatically throughout history. So maybe we should be asking a better question, a more nuanced one. What if, instead of asking, is he weak, we asked something different? What if we asked, what is he strong enough to do? Because when we reframe it like that, a completely different picture starts to emerge. Think about it. The strength to live authentically, even when it goes against cultural expectations. The strength to communicate with profound vulnerability. The strength to handle difficult emotions like jealousy without being destroyed by them. The strength to build a truly intentional relationship. These aren't weaknesses. These are all forms of profound psychological strength. And that kind of leaves us with this final thought. Calling these men weak is the easy, reflexive response, right? It's based on that old script we inherited. But that judgment, it often stops us from doing the harder work of examining our own assumptions about strength, about love, and about what it really means to know yourself. It's just a simple label slapped onto a very, very complex human reality.